Well, hello, hello, hello. Welcome and thanks for joining us this afternoon for the Speak Up rapid fire COVID questions that are going to be related to some of these Biden mandates that we had that came out this last week that obviously have everybody in a tizzy, and we definitely get that. And it's been somewhat of a wild week, to say the least. Just kind of give you some background information in case you weren't there this last week. We did have a webinar that was this last Thursday, and we specifically went through what these mandates would be, what you should expect in terms of policy development, things you need to look at. Does this apply to you? Does it not apply to you? Should your organization go down the route of requiring vaccination, or should you also think about doing weekly testing? So everything that fell within some of those pillars there, we went through. And so you guys had some great questions. It was highly attended. I think we had close to 1,000 that were there. And then we had a significant amount of questions that came. So we weren't able to get to all of them. That's why we're regathering today with our panel to go through some of those and get you some of the additional answers that were included from last week, but then also what we have going on this week, some of the new changes that are there. So we do have a great panel. Dara Wheeler's not going to be able to join us today. However, we do have Chief Medical Officer Dr. Scott Cherry, and we also have our Chief Legal Officer, which is Chuck Cable. And so they're going to be taking all of these questions in the various different categories, and we'll get you the information that you're needing. So before I pass the baton to them to kind of introduce themselves, I did want to mention that we talked about this before, but this Thursday, so as in 2 more days, this is actually the event that is going to go through not just COVID-19 mandates and regulations, et cetera, but also it's a little bit geared towards that production group. So TV, film, entertainment, et cetera, that industry. The reason why that we've included this and actually opened up that invitation to you guys as well is because this is an industry that has figured out how to do it right. They had the mandates in the very beginning to perform some of these testing cadences, and some even had to do it more frequently than once a week. So this is an organization, this is an industry that knows how to get it done. They've survived that. So if you want to join us and kind of hear some of their tips and tricks and kind of going through some of the things that we talk about there behind the scenes, you're welcome to join us. If you'll just click on that register now button that's right there at the top of your screen, it should be a box that says register now. You simply press that and that's going to get you registered, and we'd love to see you on Thursday. And the additional thing I was going to mention is the resource tab that you'll see down there at the bottom of your screen. There's some icons that are there, and you'll see one that has the appearance of books, and that's what we call the resource tab. So we have loaded some additional information in there. You should have the slides from today in addition to some white papers. So there's some free guides there about how that you can develop and implement a vaccine program in your organization. There's information on infection control. We've had a lot of interest in that recently, especially kind of gearing in that direction with the flu coming on and making some of these provisions to make for sure that your workplace is not only it's also a healthy place for everyone to perform their regular duties in. So you're definitely more than welcome to check out anything that's there. It's yours. It'll be this next Thursday. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Chuck and Scott both and let them introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into some of your questions. Dr. Cherry, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Scott Cherry. I'm Axiom Medical's Chief Medical Officer. My professional background and experience are I'm board certified in preventive medicine and public health and occupational environmental medicine. And I've been either supporting the military, government, and industrial operations for the past 15 years.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us today. And Chuck, how about you?
Sure. Thanks, Holly. Chuck Cable, everybody. Good to be here. Been a lawyer for about 20 years. I've spent half my career in the kind of head lawyer role, the general counsel role, and have also run human resource departments, talent acquisition teams, and compliance teams for that time as well. So currently, I am Chief Legal Officer for Axiom Medical. I also serve as Chief Human Resources Officer. So for all my HR folks on the phone, I feel your pain, and we're looking forward to having some good discussion today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. You're both do such a phenomenal job, and we appreciate you so much and taking the time to kind of lend your thoughts and think about things and give us some ideas on how it is that we may go about implementing some of these programs and things that they may want to consider. So just to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to do, because this is going to be the format's a little bit different than what we normally do, but what we'll do is we'll go through these specific topics. So we'll go through the OSHA mandates, we'll go through some of the COVID testing and vaccines, we'll speak about some of the policy considerations that you may want to think about, and then also pick that up on the back end where we talk about some of the support mechanisms and how it is that you're going to manage through this. So I would, before we jump into some of the questions that were here, Chuck, for anybody that didn't attend this last week or maybe isn't as familiar, could you maybe kind of give us just a summary of what it is that we're talking about, what these mandates are, and kind of what to have on the horizon in terms of expectations of when this could roll out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll do the best I can. I think, to be fair and to be clear, I don't know anything special, right? I don't have an inside track. I've not seen anything in terms of what the government intends to present. But what I do know is that I've been tracking OSHA and developments in this regard since the pandemic began, and I feel fairly confident that whatever ruling that OSHA is going to come out with is going to be consistent compared to prior publication, okay? And so in terms of what's the most instructive to prepare for a potential new emergency temporary standard, the first place that I would look is the ETS for healthcare, right, which is currently out already. And then the second place I would look is a current piece of guidance that OSHA put out and updated, I think, in August 13th, and that's called Protecting Workers, Guidance on Mitigating and Preventing the Spread of COVID-19 in the Workplace. And if I'm not mistaken, I think we may have this in Resources tab too, and if not, let us know. We can get that link out to you. But so what does that practically mean in terms of everybody else that's preparing for a potential new ruling? What it means is there are a couple core fundamental things that I think will be incorporated as part of this new standard. The first is policy, right? They're calling it the COVID-19 plan in the healthcare standard. And I think that it's almost certain that there will be a COVID-19 plan requirement for non-healthcare businesses too, right? Now, for a lot of businesses, what does that mean? It may mean just taking what you've already done and putting it on paper if you haven't already. A lot of businesses were forced to take steps to protect their own viability, right? Because if you're in a retail setting or in some other setting where you're having exposure to folks that are sick, you kind of had to take some steps to identify where you had risk and mitigate against that risk. So one of the key pieces to that policy framework, in my mind, is the concept of risk leveling, which came out in March of 2020. And so that concept speaks to within your workforce, you've got high risk, very high, medium, and low, let's just call it. I can't recall the exact categories, but I think that's pretty close. And so you kind of evaluate roles. And so, for example, a remote role should be considered low risk. And what we're thinking is that will translate into whether and to what extent you have to consider either a vaccination protocol or a weekly testing protocol for that role, okay? There's a lot of talk about the mandate. If you look carefully at the way this has been presented, it's you must be fully vaccinated or you must take part in a weekly testing cadence if you go to the office. I think those words matter, and the emphasis I bring to those words I think is very relevant in terms of how this is going to play out ultimately, because OSHA has to deliver on what the president has asked for, but OSHA is also obligated to follow its rulemaking process, okay? Not going to get into that. Didn't get into it last time. That's like a whole other session, and we need a couple lawyers to help kind of figure that out. But ultimately, I think this is where businesses should focus their time, right? Step one, policy. Step two, in the context of all that risk leveling, it's understanding how you're going to deal with your workforce and the cultural implications that will flow from this, right? Businesses that are taking a hard line and drawing that line hard and fast are experiencing turnover. Remains to be seen to what extent you have a similar impact to non-healthcare businesses, and it remains to be seen whether non-healthcare businesses are going to take that hard line and say you must be vaccinated. There's certainly cost implications that are kind of peppered throughout this issue. There's been some suggestion that the government may be offering a form of subsidies for a testing protocol. Maybe they're going to offer, continue to offer vaccines for free with perhaps a subsidy for the service that goes along with the provision of the vaccine. I don't know. Okay, I do not know, but these are the issues to consider. And then the last thing I think high level that we need to be mindful of is how do we plan and prepare for kind of exemptions? People that are coming at us with medical exemptions, with sincerely held religious beliefs, and how those things get managed. I think ultimately businesses need to kind of refresh and perhaps re-engage on the way in which they're conducting what's called an undue hardship analysis. I think that primarily is the route that's going to be the most effective in terms of determining whether these requests for exemption should be granted or not. I have some concerns that digging deeply into medical histories, digging deeply into the sincerity of someone's religious belief, could create additional risk and challenge down the road, but again, remains to be seen. So I'll stop talking there. I think that's kind of the high level summary of, we got into a whole bunch, obviously, last time around, but that kind of gives you my perspective, high level, on the things that businesses should be thinking about.
Yeah, definitely great information. Anything that you wanted to add to that, Dr. Cherry?
No, I think Chuck covered it well. Yeah.
Good. All right. So what we'll do is we'll start it out then with some of the OSHA mandates, some of the questions that we had specific to this. And just kind of as a reminder for those that have joined us here, if you have a question, please feel free to include that right there in that Q&A box that's at the bottom of the screen. And we will make for sure, I'm trying to watch that at the same time that we have these as well. So we'll definitely kind of keep our eye on that and make for sure that we're not missing your question. But please feel free to add those there. So for the OSHA mandates, and either one of you, I guess, Chuck or Dr. Cherry, you're welcome to answer. But I think Jimmy was the first one to ask. They were asking about the steps that they may have to go through before something like that is being enacted. And so the question was, I guess, where he's really going with this is how much longer do we think it's going to be before we have a final mandate that comes out?
Yeah, I can maybe offer some thoughts on that point. We're talking about kind of the ruling itself, right? And when's it going to come out, and what's that process look like, right?
Yeah. Correct.
So the way it works is, OSHA goes through a process. In order for them to issue what's called an emergency temporary standard, there's this thing called the grave danger standard. And essentially OSHA has to establish that there is a grave danger to the employee population such that an emergency temporary standard is required. On the healthcare standard, they spent a ton of time in comments contained in the Federal Register explaining why, there was a grave danger for COVID risk in the healthcare sector. They have to do the same thing in the non-healthcare sector, right? They have to arrive at a position and communicate it in the Federal Register in anticipation of challenges, okay? So that's kind of the first element that has to be required. And then there's ultimately, under the Administrative Procedures Act, a promulgation approach that has to be followed relative to this stuff, okay? Generally, an ETS is going to be effective when it's published in the Federal Register, okay, which is a book that you learn about when you're a lawyer, and it's a place where you record kind of the process of how you arrive at and the actual text of these regulations. Remains to be seen whether there will be a grace period or not here. There was a grace period for healthcare. I think there's a grace period in terms of the obligation on federal employees. So it remains to be seen whether we get the same benefit on non-healthcare businesses. I think we probably will, but what that looks like and what that time frame is, I don't know. But technically speaking, the rule is effective once it's published in the Federal Register.
Hey, Chuck, just real quick, this grave danger kind of threshold is interesting to me. I know for healthcare workers, the relative risk of exposure to COVID is probably much higher than non-healthcare worker populations. I think I've been seeing the incidence of COVID hanging around 1% in kind of the general population. And have you ever seen kind of any numbers or metrics of the amount of risk to the population that would kind of meet the grave standard, or is it on a case-by-case basis?
So interesting question. And there's case law that kind of speaks to these issues. And there was a quote from the U.S. Supreme Court speaking about the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and that it is not, so under its rulemaking authority, the OSHA Act is not a mathematical straitjacket.
Okay.
Nor does it require the agency to support its findings with anything approaching scientific certainty. Okay? Particularly when operating on the frontiers of scientific knowledge. So no, right? There's not a metric. I think there are issues of perception. There's issues of politics at play here. But there's also issues of unknown risk to individuals who perhaps have not contracted the disease yet. And since we do not know what makes one person get horribly, horribly ill, sometimes even if they're vaccinated, and what makes somebody else not get horribly ill, since we don't know the genetic reasons why that's the case, or the reasons from an epidemiological perspective why that's the case, perhaps there is an argument that if you're exposed in any way, shape, or form, that in and of itself creates a potential grave danger. And the value of a life is the value of a life, and that's enough. Or the value of whatever the percentage is of how many folks are dying from COVID right now. And I don't, Scott, you probably know that I don't. I don't. It's this kind of intersection of so many different interests that's coming into the way I think grave danger is going to be perceived. I think you're going to have clearly a challenge to it. Will the ruling, be withheld, or will effectiveness be withheld? Why it's challenged? Only if there's an injunction indicating that it will be kind of paused pending resolution of the dispute, which again is you got to wait and see what happens. So
that's interesting. And actually, we didn't coordinate that question, so I'm very impressed, Chuck, that you had that background. To be truthful, I don't know if it's my job to, but as I think through it, there's this thing called stochastic effects in medical surveillance where there's a form of randomness. So like a lot of radiation exposure has a stochastic principle, which is randomness. And so I think you're kind of speaking to that through that Supreme Court. I think it's more broad too about perception, which is also very important. And our clients do face the perception risk relative to the community exposure. So I'll leave it at that, but very interesting.
Yeah. And I think, the perceptional challenge and the perceptional risks here are particularly interesting in the context of a business's culture. Again, as you know, I'm part HR, right? I've lived that life for a number of years as well. And so, the implications for the team that's working for the business are something that needs to be considered here. Clearly, I think whether you have a mass kind of exodus or not, right? So you mandate it. If you don't, you get fired. Everyone complies except for the folks that have medical exemptions. And let's say you figure all that out. You're still communicating a message to your folks, and they may not be happy about it, right? You don't know what the longer term effects of that decision are going to be, but it'll ferret itself out over time. So I think the businesses that have had the luxury of maturing to a point that you've got a more holistic view of culture, you've got a culture by design, you're taking steps to consistently kind of monitor and enhance, and taking steps to further that kind of design. we'll be very focused on this in terms of how this gets rolled out, right? I have a number of friends that are CEOs, CFOs. Businesses are doing kind of surveys as well from their populations to try to understand what a mandate that the business would, kind of put on them would do, trying to figure it out. So.
Yeah. Lots of great information. Yeah. So just kind of to expand upon that, Chuck, with what you were talking about the grace period, et cetera, I think that we'd gotten something this week also from Alexis that was asking about, did we think that OSHA would issue like a warning or a follow-up if they were found to be not compliant whenever that was assessed, or would they start that $14,000 per occurrence penalty immediately?
Well, So I don't know the answer to that, but I certainly think that if you're a business that is honestly taking steps to manage this risk, and you have a written policy and you're attempting to follow it and you're taking steps to follow it, and you can show that you've taken steps, if you've got kind of these foot fault instances of noncompliance, perhaps it's less likely you're going to get dinged as hard on those instances of noncompliance. If, on the other hand, you're a business that has taken a political stance or has otherwise said, we're not doing anything, and we're just going to let this ferret itself out. And then once we have clarity around it, then we're going to move forward. And I shouldn't say political. I mean, a lot of times it's more dollars and cents based, right? Like, I can't afford to do this. Right. If you're in that boat and you're just taking a stance saying, look, I can't do this. This is just not. And, someone, is there's an outbreak and OSHA investigates, or they just start to, conduct random site surveys, and they find out that not only have you not taken steps to, create some kind of a testing or vaccination protocol, but in fact, you haven't done anything, you don't have a policy in place, and you're not doing anything to protect your workforce, that may be a little bit different, right? And so you may find less tolerance for those kinds of violations. Again, it's speculation. I mean, I'm just kind of basing it off of what I've seen and heard of and the way I think it should work in a rational world. Mm-hmm. Are we living in a rational world right now? I don't know. I mean, I think it could go either way. And so with respect to that, perhaps this is all about finding a balance within your organization from a cost-benefit perspective, right? And taking that path forward.
The other question I was going to ask you about that was, it does see, I think I was reading this last week where they were talking about, obviously it was speculation, but how this would be implemented and how some of those penalties would be assessed. And so one of the points they did mention was that even if OSHA isn't there at your organization to investigate, if you're compliant with this, they do have the authority, if they're there for any other reason, to also audit you on these policies, correct?
Yeah, and I think that the way this plays out, I mean, practically the other piece to this that hasn't really gotten any press that I've seen, correct me if I'm wrong, but back in January, I think the president also said that we were going to enhance kind of OSHA's presence and start to recruit more people and bring it back up to a level that was more consistent with prior administrations before the Republican administration kind of moved out, the Trump administration moved out. Now, you may not be obligated to keep an OSHA 300 log, but you're still going to be obligated to follow the ETS. You know what I mean? And so, and practically speaking, the way that OSHA's approached, kind of COVID and how it can be acquired at work, I mean, whether you're required to have a log or not, you still have to have a process to track what you're doing to create a safer environment. When people are getting sick, and are you doing some level of contact tracing to kind of narrow it down to a specified department, location, et cetera, and managing it that way. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. All right, one more, and then we'll move on to the others, because I know we have 3 more that are left here. But I did want to ask about this one that came in. Let's see, I think it was Melanie, and she was asking, how will OSHA gather regarding the percentage of employees not yet vaccinated or out of compliance, and how will they enforce the OSHA 300 reporting within exempt industries, such as like an IT software company?
Yeah, I mean, so that's kind of the issue. I guess I jumped ahead a little bit and spoke about that question in the answer I just gave. Again, if you're not obligated to keep the log, it doesn't mean you don't have an obligation to respond to an OSHA inquiry, because the other thing that can happen here is your employees could start calling on you. You know, if you're an IT services business or not, I mean, they could start calling, and if the ETS applies by its own terms to that kind of a business, then you're still going to be held accountable. You know.
All right, well, let's move on to COVID testing and vaccination here. I think that this is where the majority of the questions kind of reside. The first was, there's been a lot, and I think Rich had written this, several others, and yeah, I think you even mentioned part of this in the very opening, but will there be an adequate supply of some of these test kits that are difficult to source now, especially in the volume that they're seeing, and could there be federal funding to assist with some of those employer costs?
So there may be a component of subsidy baked into the standard for a defined period of time. Again, speculation, don't know. I've heard some rumors that perhaps that may be on the table, but those are the kinds of terms that get heavily negotiated when you're looking to push, you know, regulation out like this. So we'll have to see where that issue lies. From a supply chain standpoint, it depends on what kind of test kit you're talking about. And this is based directly on Axiom Medical's experience in the testing environment, because as Holly said at the beginning, in the TV and film space that's had, you know, cadence testing in place for what seems like a million years, but has been since the pandemic started. You know, we're very well aware of supply chain challenges. I can tell you that over-the-counter kits, good luck finding those until probably December at the earliest. Folks have been kind of clamoring to get their hands on the OTC kits. Now, the medical kits, if you have the ability to purchase through medical supply chains, are still available. So for example, there's an Abbott Binax medical kit that is not over-the-counter, but has to be administered either by or under the supervision of a medical professional for it to be valid. Those kits are still available. PCR testing is still available, which is the molecular, send it to a lab, get a result type testing that we're familiar with. Most of us are by now. But it's those rapid kind of at-home kits that you're going to see the biggest supply chain pinch on, because I think those are gone as we sit here today. And as I said, I don't expect us to be able to start buying those again until probably December. You know, we had to be very forward-thinking over the past several weeks in terms of our relationship with a lot of those suppliers to make sure we had supply. So.
For sure. And then, Sherry, I may give this one to you. I think Terry had asked, would there be any value in doing random COVID testing similar to what would be done with random drug testing in a large manufacturing facility?
Yes, we've
been.
Oh, sorry.
Go, Scott. No, you go. Go for it.
Yeah. You know, I would say it's something that we've been advocating as a best practice for our clients once testing was available. You know, obviously, you can have an approach to test symptomatic personnel, but because there's such a high proportion of asymptomatic infected people with significant viral loads, you know, an approach can be some type of sampling of your workforce, maybe depending on, you know, how big your numbers are, having an approach that samples different regions at different periods. And I think that may go a long way potentially to show OSHA that you're being proactive at determining what's happening in your workforce. And so, for instance, a common strategy would be, you know, if you are doing a random testing event, determine some type of metric of infection rate, and then compare what's happening in your local community where your employees live. And you'll get a sense of, is the workplace having a higher or lower infection rate? And that can give you insight into determine if your protective measures, that multi-layered approach, is actually working or not. And so I think that's a great best practice that we do implement with lots of our clients. And we've been very successful at this with the entertainment industry, where usually their infection rates are almost at 0%, practically, usually a 10th to a 100th what the local community is seeing. So it does work, and so you need to balance your risk, as Chuck says, based on your budget for that as well.
Yeah.
Right.
And just for clarification, I think we're seeing a lot that are coming through here on the queue, and then also we had this last week. You're not aware, correct, of testing requirement on the type of testing that's going to be required by OSHA, correct, Dr. Sherry or Chuck? You're not aware of what those would be?
Yeah, Chuck and I have been kind of brainstorming, and I think there's some potential wording in the document that allows for at-home tests. So, that does speak to antigen testing, but I think it's preliminary right now. Is that your feeling still, Chuck?
Yeah, I mean, it's contextual, right? I mean, I think the fact that at the same time they announced the standard, the administration talked about the ability to purchase, OTC kits at cost from big box retailers, to me, suggests that antigen testing is going to be okay. PCR testing, as we know, has been the standard, and antigen has been growing in acceptance for some kind of testing cadences, over the past 18 months. So.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, let's see. Also, I think Trish was asking about how would boosters impact these vaccination requirements. Either of you want to speak on some of the booster decisions that were made that were published this week, and how that may be taken into account for these regulations?
I think my thoughts on this are that it depends on how the FDA or the CDC view what's considered fully vaccinated. And so depending on, and I think they've decided at this point that a booster shot is not indicated for the general public. It's more for high risk categories. But if that does change, that may actually make the fully vaccinated category very, very dynamic. So at some frequency, people will be considered fully vaccinated, and then they will actually become non-compliant. And that is kind of a traditional medical surveillance program that we're used to dealing with in occupational medicine. I think before it was, okay, I'm going to have my 2 shots or my 1 shot, and then I will be fully compliant. So again, if that comes about to where a booster is required to have adequate immunity, then that would drastically change the emergency temporary standard functionality. And so you would have people at some period, 6 or 8 months, potentially going out of the fully vaccinated category, then needing testing until they become compliant. I think early on, compliance will be easier, but then I think complacency may start, just like with any medical surveillance program, complacency starts hitting. And so 2-3 years out, it's really hard to wrangle people to become, just the compliance rate drastically drops. So those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah. And then what about, we've had this one that's came up a lot too, which was speaking to those that have antibodies. So the question was, some of our vaccinated employees, some were testing positive, but the others were asking, can they accept an antibody test instead of a formal vaccination or weekly testing if they have an employee that has already had COVID?
Yeah, I think that also depends on how our agencies are viewing or defining immunity. Right now, they have been fairly silent on natural infection as a valid pathway to be considered immune. I think there's been some really strong studies that have highlighted the robustness of natural infection immunity. And so I think this will be part of something to consider in the ETS. So, and Chuck, looked like you had something to say there too as well.
Yeah, there's so when you start to talk about the presence of antibodies and kind of the volume, for lack of a better term, of those antibodies in somebody's genetic makeup, it begins to, in my mind, cross over into the world of genetic information as defined under the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And so there's an interesting to be determined kind of issue here in my mind. I think that, under GINA, the genetic information of an individual cannot be used against them in terms of making hiring decisions, et cetera. Is kind of the first issue. Now, it certainly could be possible to voluntarily produce that information for the limited purpose of ensuring, consistency with the standard. I think this is where kind of what I should have mentioned also at the very beginning, right? The volume of data points that HR will be expected to manage, combined with the sensitivity around this information, is such a big deal, right? So when you've got potential discrimination issues already on the exemption side, and then we start talking about somebody's genetic information, that's an even bigger deal because, GINA specifically says you cannot take steps against someone based on their genetic information. And you do the antibody test to determine someone's relative immunity in theory to a disease, right? Which I think qualifies. Maybe it doesn't. I'm not the doctor Scott is, but I think there's an issue there to be ferreted out. And so all that means is consent process is going to be important when we start to talk about antibodies, because to Scott's point, I do think this is going to be someone's natural immunity from having an infection is something that's going to have to be encountered at some point here. But the way in which it's managed is going to be a little bit different, and you need to be a little more cautious as an employer because you've got that kind of confidential medical file, right, that you're supposed to have in your HR files. Now more than ever, you really have to put the lockdown on that thing and make sure that any information that's getting shared is not being shared to the wrong people that could potentially create, some implicit bias around someone because they know something about them that they're not supposed to know.
Yeah.
So some interesting, risk issues popping up here.
Definitely. All right, let's see. Let's move on to policy considerations. There's a lot of questions here. All right, so the first one was from Sandra that was asking, we are fully remote. Does this mean that I have to start monitoring informal work gatherings, such as Billy goes to Sally's home or stops by the office to quickly get something for a project?
Well, look, I think I talked a little bit about risk leveling, and so I'm hearing kind of two different things there, though, to be fair. You can't be fully remote and then have these occasions where you're going to the office, right? What you can be is primarily remote and going to the office like to pick up a paycheck or to pick up some mail that came in or whatever the case is. But on that particular, I'm just going to talk about that instance first here. In that kind of scenario, you as a business have to create a policy that's designed to provide protection. And so do you as a business think that if someone who primarily works from home is infected and they show up at the office to get their mail and pick up their paycheck and they're in the office for 20 minutes and maybe they see, Bill, who they haven't seen in a while, and they chit chat with him for another 30 minutes at close range without a mask, and then they leave and you've done nothing, is that the right solution here? I'm not your business. I don't know. Part of this whole discussion depends upon the risk tolerance and the risk appetite of your organization. But if you're going to go through the process of creating a policy document, which it sounds like we're all going to have to do, doesn't it make sense for you to have a mechanism to make sure that folks that are in that bucket, you've got some kind of a protocol to manage that? Whether it's a drive-by where they drive by and somebody runs it out to them, whether it's a rapid test that you have to take at some location within X number of hours of you showing up. If it's in a, pop meeting, got to be there because I sit at a level that I have to be there for, you make arrangements to have, kind of a rapid test set up right there to run through it. I can't tell you how many times my chief operating officer, who is super focused on stopping the spread, when we have in-person meetings, you better believe we got people there doing testing for us.
Absolutely.
So I think that's what you think about in those contexts. When you talk about it, running over to somebody's house, I don't know if that's social or if that's work. If it's a work sanctioned thing, then policy should apply to it. If it's two people who are friends outside of work making a decision, I mean, that's probably not within the purview of the policy, and it is what it is, right? But all this other stuff you're doing should protect the balance of the employees who may get exposure to infection.
Hey, just to add on to that real quickly, an approach I like to take when you're looking at how to create a policy that's protective is actually reverse engineering a contact trace. So, we've had so much experience with contact tracing. And so you want to develop a policy that really simplifies contact tracing, right? So say I come in to meet with Chuck at the office. If the policy doesn't, if I end up becoming positive within 2 days of talking to Chuck, if we don't have a policy that addresses close contact, testing, masking, all those things, then potentially anyone I interact when I come into the office is going to be susceptible to close contacting and then even quarantine, right? So I think I'll just leave it at the high level, but really if you're whether you have the internal expertise or you're talking with your consultant, like one of your approaches should be reverse engineering, minimizing exposure if there was a positive in the workplace, because you could essentially have personnel policies that protect the workforce even if someone was positive. No one's within 6 feet, no one spends more than 10 minutes with each other, face masking. If you're testing, then you actually have a really strong approach. I think one of the limitations in testing is we're held at the level of if someone tests positive, you have to go back 48 hours from that test positive, even if you're not symptomatic. So taking a test, has its limitations, although I think it's a great practice, but you still have to go back 48 hours. So I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah. Great information. So I think that we covered this one to a degree. I think, Chuck, you might have mentioned it earlier, but just to give Vicki a confirmation here, the question was, if the employee claims a medical exemption, is the employer allowed to ask for the medical information? And then the additional question was, what all can we ask the employee for if we're going to make that kind of determination?
Yeah, I mean, you're entitled to get medical verification of a condition that's sufficient to kind of meet the exemption, right? The challenge for the HR team is ensuring that if that communication necessarily includes other confidential health information that could, indicate a disability, then you have to make sure that gets protected, secured, not shared, because you don't want to have someone, claiming that they're being discriminated against because of a disability as well. Right. So, and that's well settled, been around for a very long time in terms of how you manage the flow of information. But yes, you can ask. But again, you've got to have kind of that designated confidential medical file that only certain people have access to. You can't just put this in like a regular HR file online or in a paper file if you do it the old fashioned way. You can't just have it there for anybody to see.
Yeah. And then Chrissy was asking, why are only unvaccinated employees being tested when vaccinated people are also testing positive and spreading the virus? Isn't that a form of discrimination or profiling? And isn't that still putting the company at risk?
Well, I mean, in terms of the concern over discrimination and profiling, so only if there's a disparate impact on a segment of the population that's already protected, right? So the Supreme Court has not enunciated a standard that says that unvaccinated people are protected and deserve a higher level of scrutiny regarding discrimination as they have people based on race, gender, et cetera, religious affiliation, right? So I think it's easy for us to kind of gut check with that, right? And say, wait, a group's being treated differently because of something that, is personal to them. But right now, that's not the way the law works. And I think that from a public policy and in the best interest of the employer, I don't know where this testing protocol is going to go. I think that to your point, in terms of the way you're asking the question, you're right. I mean, people that are vaccinated can get sick, can and have gotten sick, horribly sick.
Right.
But the bigger risk right now, at least in terms of the way it's being portrayed, are the unvaccinated population. Now, unvaccinated with history of prior infection, don't know. But I think right now the workaround that is attempting to be introduced here is this concept of fully vaccinated or weekly testing cadence. And that may just be, I don't know how that's going to get ferreted out. We'll see.
Yeah, from the medical perspective, I've thought through this too, and maybe not using the word discrimination, but differentiation between the two groups. I think there was a lot of momentum when the vaccines were released about, this is really the end of the pandemic. And so, if that stayed the case, I think that's where it makes sense to have these rules that are very binary about policies about vaccinated are good to go, unvaccinated need testing. But I think in the last few months, but especially the last month or so, there's been studies and lots of anecdotes about how vaccinated, can get sick, can get infected, maybe even some severe disease. Although I think still overall, vaccines are very effective at preventing severe disease overall. And you're still effective at preventing infection or limiting the duration of infection. But there's also data that shows if a vaccinated person does get infected, they can have the same high levels of viral load based on cycle threshold counts. So, this may be a lingering kind of momentum that has hit the ETS, but it may evolve quickly with now more studies showing some of the imperfections of the vaccine, so to speak. So I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay. All right, two more here. The first one that caught my eye that came through just now was Linda and was asking, a customer requires that our field service techs have a visual indicator of their vaccination status, such as a hard hat sticker. How do we square that with privacy requirements?
Interesting. So certainly employers are allowed to ask whether someone's vaccinated under the ADA's fit for duty standard, right? Where it has to be I just blanked on the standard, but consistent with job related, there we go, job related and consistent with business necessity. The EEOC is not going to argue with that right now in terms of asking whether someone's vaccinated or not. Now, what's interesting is about kind of a different job site is in the ETS standard for healthcare, there's a specific section that talks about an employer's obligation when its employees are working at a different job site. And generally speaking, those employers have to share information and agree on the standards that will be used at that shared work site. Okay. So it's a really interesting question. In terms of that outward kind of representation of vaccination status. I think if it's limited to kind of this job site, to kind of employers agreeing on approach, it's probably going to be okay. But I don't know. I mean, so all this stuff is so new. We'll figure it out. But I think the information we're able to get access to because of, kind of fit for duty and ADA standard. Whether we can, force someone to publish that information, for lack of a better term, there may need to be some pretty tight guidelines around that. I don't know. It's a good question.
Very good question. I like that one. I saw this one that Felicity had that was asking, I think we've covered this one before in prior events, but was asking specifically about the liability associated with mandating a vaccine. So her question was, if we say that all of our employees have to be vaccinated and one of the employees has a reaction to the vaccine, does that then make us liable for what that reaction was?
Yeah, I mean, there is an immunity granted to the manufacturers of the vaccine right now, people like putting the shot in your arm, and under the situation, probably employers, although I don't know for a fact, I may have to check it, but part of the emergency use authorization triggered a different statutory scheme whereby there was this grant of immunity under, I think, statute, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it was the American Rescue Act. I don't know which one, but But as it stands right now, there's statutory immunity for many of the functions related to the provisioning of vaccines.
Yeah, and I think addition to that, just vaccinations in general fall under kind of a different federal program called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And so it's kind of outside the usual court systems. My non-legal speak there, but, you know, and that's just for vaccinations in general. But if an employer is requiring something for work and an injury comes about from that or potential, then actually it would go into the workers' comp realm. And so obviously I think we think of workers' comp as for physical injuries, but it's much more broad than that. It's any injury or illness that potentially comes from work relatedness. So as Chuck said, if the business or the mandate says it's business necessity, then that would be a remedy. So those are kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, good.
Yeah.
Good additions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So for COVID management support, so this is both of you, but I'll start with you, Chuck. I'll put you in the hot seat here. So they say we are trying to gauge how much of an administrative burden it's going to be to manage processing proof of weekly COVID testing. Can employers survey employees to determine who has and who has not been vaccinated?
Yeah, so two different issues there. I think I answered the survey question. The answer is yes, you can ask if people are vaccinated as long as it's job-related, consistent with business necessity. And if you're attempting to comply with an emergency temporary standard or an established infection prevention policy, chances are you're going to be good there, okay? Mm-hmm. That will then determine what pool of employees you're working with that are not vaccinated and presumably would have to engage in a weekly testing cadence, right, for you to figure that out. Depends on how big your business is, but you take that kind of population with some play over time for turnover, and you'll extrapolate out, how many tests that is, whether you're just going to kind of pop something in a file or save it as a PDF every single time it happens, or whether you're going to go have a vendor manage that information for you. The key here again is ensuring that in the context of these testing events or this testing protocol, you have enough access and enough usability of information to do the things you need to do in the event of an infection or, Lord forbid, an outbreak, right? It's like contact tracing, geolocation when they're taking these tests, where they visited. There's kind of a whole other set of complications when you begin to think about, well, what happens if you're doing a testing protocol and somebody pops positive, and then you've got a successive, indication of a bunch of other folks popping positive. And by the way, they all worked in the same department, in the same building, on the same floor. And they periodically were moving to here, to here, to there, to there, to there, to there. And all of a sudden you've got perhaps a bigger problem. It's just thinking through the data points that are involved in kind of the fundamental process and ensuring that they're usable and that you can actually get something out of that data other than just saying, got the test done, because ultimately you want to try to get some value out of this process if you're going to have to comply with it, I think.
Yeah,
so
I think
the burden could be fairly extreme depending upon the mechanism or the systems you currently utilize to track, this confidential medical portion of someone's HR file, and then connecting it back to your infection control policy and approach.
Yeah. Maybe what I'll just add real quick, because it did pop into my mind. So, in the practice of medicine, doctors have been warned as we go through training, don't order tests. You don't know what to do with the results. But what's interesting here is there's no doctor ordering the test. It's basically emergency temporary standard giving out over-the-counter tests. But what happens is the company ends up receiving these results. And so I think one of the biggest risks is failure to act. So say, you're getting every morning you get a fax of, how many employees you have, right, per week. And if someone misses a positive, right, if you're just kind of doing the paper shuffle, then there's so much, there's kind of several strands of liability. One, you have to make sure that that employee that tests positive is out for the appropriate amount of time, and then that their employees are actually, or their coworkers that may have been exposed or contact traced. And so I don't know if the ETS will address that, but I think the liability will exist regardless of if the ETS addresses it or not, because that's what happens with medical information, Yeah.
And the other piece to this too, don't forget, is so people keep kind of foot faulting to a discussion around vaccinations and testing. That's probably not the only stuff you're going to have to track. I mean, if the healthcare standard is any indication, the concept of daily healthcare attestations is also required. And so you have to be prepared for that too. And that's a whole other slew of data points that have to be tracked and coordinated among the other data that you're kind of utilizing in this environment, right? The way to think about it is, I'm going to talk about Axiom just for 1 second, right? So we have a tool called Check Into Work, and that tool is designed to meet that need, right? Of providing an opportunity to have a daily healthcare assessment with reporting functionality to the right people at the right time without sharing too much, et cetera, right? So a tool like that, okay, is what we're talking about to manage. Or you've got your questionnaire and you're having people, like I go to my daughter's gymnastics, filling out the little form every time I show up to take her to gymnastics about whether she's had, an exposure, been tested positive, or symptoms or whatever.
But that's a big thing, Chuck. When I was in the military still, my last duty station was a highly safety sensitive site. And so I was part of the personnel reliability program. And so I was inspected quarterly by many different agencies. And you may think you're doing a good job, but if you can't prove you're doing it, there's absolutely no recourse. And so that's what auditors or inspectors are looking at is, so they need to show that stack of papers or at least some annotation of records, because essentially the inspector will go out and say, okay, I'm here, I'm an employee, I'm showing up for work, what's my next step? And so, you really have to be pretty on the spot for this when they're looking for it. So it's really about having a process for all these things that seem very straightforward.
Definitely. Yeah.
Right.
And Melanie, to answer your question there, so Melanie was asking about, are we aware of any tracking tools that help with this, that would track vaccination, testing, et cetera? Not that we would toot our own horn. Obviously, we it's not that we want to just promote our products. We do these for education primarily. But yes, Melanie, if you have questions about that, we do have tools that I think Chuck had mentioned, the Check Into Work, and then we also have the Vaccine Vault and tracks those as well. So if that's something that you need information on or some help with, we'd be happy to provide that for you. All right, one last question, and I don't even know that we're going to have time to get all the way through it, but we may have to just take the high level on this one and then dig in a little bit closer maybe next week. But it was specific to, will we need to think about some of this testing and vaccinations from a benefit plan requirement, or will we see that there's some changes there? And I saw that, I think it was Elizabeth that was asking about, she mentioned also about Delta Airlines implementing some of these things with their dependents and how that would be included in the mandate, this, that, and the other. Any brief thoughts about that, Chuck, that you wanted to add, or maybe something to put on the radar?
One thought, just generally about the concept of kind of pushing the expense and the administration over to a health benefit plan, you're kind of giving up the employer's access to the information, because once the health plan's paying for it, it's protected. You've got HIPAA concerns there, right? From an occupational medicine perspective, right, we want to keep this in the world of ADA, fit for duty, very well established, kind of precedent related to what an employer can ask for, what's called a permissible or a permissive medical inquiry, for example, both pre-hire, conditional offer, and then after hire. you've got some protections, that give you useful information. And to Scott's point, don't order a test you don't know what to do with the results. If you're giving up your access to all that information, it's going to be really hard for you to run a program. You're going to have to ask for consent, really essentially. And maybe you'll get it, or maybe there'll be an amendment to HIPAA, to kind of give you what you need, or maybe there's an exception I'm not thinking about right now. But you certainly can't use healthcare operations because you're not a covered entity or a business associate, presumably. So that's kind of from a high level perspective, that's what kind of cuts that off in my mind as a viable alternative right now. That's that. Yeah.
A lot to think about. So it sounds like that we may need to kind of, head back to the table and really think about what the benefit would be if you pass that along. It could kind of put us in penalizing positions or compromising positions in terms of what type of access that you would have to some of that data. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us. I know we're right here at time. What I would say is that we get it. This is a lot to swallow, and it is a huge ask that has been landed on your plates. What I will say is that even if we don't have the answers, we could try to at least give you what it is that our subject matter experts, what their best thoughts are, maybe some recommendations, things like that. If you come across questions that you need an answer for, you're always welcome to, send it to me on social. You can send it to us. We've got the email address that's coronavirus@axiomllc.com, any of those things. So just send that in to us and we'll have you to get you some additional answers there. So before I go, we have the white paper, obviously, that's going to give you some information about the long-term infection control programs. Those are going to be a hot topic for several months down the road, obviously. And then the last thing is, if you want to join us on Thursday, I think it's going to be some really good information, kind of give you that behind-the-scenes look at what's going on in that industry that's already been working within some of these very defined protocols and strict standards. So we would love to have you join us. You can click right there on the Register Now button. That will get you signed up. You don't have to enter any additional information. So thank you, Chuck, and also Dr. Cherry. You guys did a great job, and I appreciate all of you, and we will see you then hopefully on Thursday. Thank you.
Bye.